Have you ever heard of a country where a war was fought over soccer? What about an intern who almost caused an impeachment in the United States? What's more, have you heard about a young president who wears a cap, a leather jacket, and has wiped out gangs? What kind of place is that? That's El Salvador. Today, Bello Mundo will take you to discover a city extinguished by a volcano, a 100-hour war that started with a game, and the decisions of a leader who defies the rules. Are you ready to find out more? Number 1. Location and geographical data. El Salvador may be small in size, but what it lacks in territory, it makes up for in diversity. With just over 20,000 square kilometers, the country is the smallest in Central America, but its landscapes show that you don't have to be big to impress. Surrounded by mountains, valleys, and a long coastline bathed by the Pacific, every corner has something different to show. With a tropical climate that is divided between a rainy season from May to October and a dry one from November to April, the heat is constant in the coastal areas. In the mountainous regions, however, the climate brings cool relief, especially near the volcanoes, which are a trademark of the country. In fact, there are more than 20 volcanoes, some still active, that shape not only the landscape, but also the character of those who live there. The forests that once covered much of the territory have given way to agriculture and the growth of cities. But there are still important reserves, such as El Imposible National Park, which protects some of the local nature. And speaking of nature, the country is known for its great variety of orchids and the izote flower, the national symbol, which contrast with the green of the forests and the blue of the Pacific waters. For surfers, the beaches are a chapter apart. El Tunco, for example, is famous the world over for its perfect waves, attracting adventurers from all corners of the globe. Number 2. The flower from The Little Prince is from El Salvador. And while we're on the subject of flowers, who hasn't heard of The Little Prince, one of the best-selling books of all time? But few people know that the iconic rose in the story was inspired by the author's wife, Consuelo de Saint-Exupéry, who was born in El Salvador. Consuelo, who married the author Antoine de Saint-Exupéry in 1931, brought much more than inspiration to the work. Their turbulent relationship served as the basis for the creation of the vain and fragile rose in the famous book. In the story, the little prince speaks with affection and frustration about the flower he had cared for so much, but which didn't seem to return his love in the way he had hoped. The rose, vain and demanding, makes the little prince wonder about his place by her side until he decides to leave his planet in search of answers in other worlds. When it's time to leave, however, the rose says goodbye sincerely, revealing that, behind all the pretension, she also loved him. This dynamic between the characters is, in fact, a reflection of the couple's own relationship, marked by ups and downs, love and disagreements. Raised in a wealthy family, her life was marked by international travel and study. However, her life choices, including a divorce that was frowned upon at the time and her second marriage to a much older Guatemalan writer, made her the target of criticism. After the death of her second husband, Consuelo settled in Buenos Aires, where she later met Saint-Exupéry. They had an intense but difficult romance. The French elite did not accept her, and the infidelities of both brought even more tension to the marriage. Even so, Consuelo remained the author's muse, and it is from her that the inspiration for the famous Rose in the Little Prince comes. Number 3. Cinematic inspiration. And it's not just in literature that a Salvadoran has inspired great works. Cinema has also received his influence, and one of the best-known examples is the movie A Beautiful Mind. This 2001 production tells the story of mathematician John Nash, played by Russell Crowe, winner of the Nobel Prize for Economics. The movie, like real life, shows Nash's relationship with Alicia Larday, a brilliant physicist and one of the few women of her time at MIT. Alicia, as well as being his wife, played a crucial role in the mathematician's life, especially during the times when he was dealing with schizophrenia. What many people don't know is that Alicia Larday was born in El Salvador. Her career at MIT led her to meet John Nash and begin a life that would be marked by both challenges and achievements. Their relationship, full of ups and downs, resulted in a marriage and a divorce, but the bond between the two remained intact. After years of personal struggles, they reconciled and moved back in together, facing the difficulties of Nash's schizophrenia and social prejudice. The couple's life was portrayed in the biography A Beautiful Mind, which inspired the movie. Although the production took some liberties, it sensitively portrayed Alicia's devotion to her husband and her determination to help him overcome his greatest challenges. Sadly, in 2015, Alicia and John Nash died in a tragic car accident in New Jersey, shortly after returning from a trip to Norway, where Nash had been honored. Number 4. Schindler from El Salvador. The Second World War remains one of the darkest chapters in history, leaving deep traces of pain and revolt around the world. One of the best-known accounts of that time is that of Oskar Schindler, whose famous list saved hundreds of lives and even became the subject of a movie. The so-called Schindler's List contained the names of 806 Polish Jewish women who worked in his factory in Krakow, Poland. The German industrialist used his position and resources to prevent these women from being sent to concentration camps in March 1944. Her act of courage and resistance during the Holocaust has become a symbol of humanity in the midst of such horror. However, what few people know is that there was another heroic figure during the war, and he came from El Salvador. José Arturo Castellanos, who worked as the Salvadoran consul in Geneva, also risked everything to save lives. Realizing that the Nazis knew little about El Salvador, he began issuing false Salvadoran citizenship papers to thousands of Jews, guaranteeing the safety of more than 40,000 people during the war. Number 5. The Lewinsky family. During the Second World War, one of the families that found shelter in El Salvador during this dark period was the Lewinsky family. Does the surname sound familiar? Maybe you haven't connected the dots yet, but let's refresh your memory. Do you remember Monica Lewinsky, the famous intern who got involved in the scandal with the President of the United States and presented a dress worn on the day of the affair that contained traces of what happened? Surprise! Monica's father, Bernard Lewinsky, is from El Salvador. The family, of Jewish and German origin, fled Nazi persecution and settled in El Salvador, like many others who sought refuge in Latin America during that period. You can already see that El Salvador is present in many historical events. Number 6. History. Continuing our journey, it's time to delve into El Salvador's turbulent past, a country whose history is far from tranquil. When the Spanish arrived in the country at the beginning of the 16th century, El Salvador was integrated into the vast Spanish Empire, becoming an important center for the production of coffee and indigo. But this was only the first of many changes. At the beginning of the 19th century, the country gained its independence from Spain and briefly joined the Central American Federation. However, internal conflicts soon led to the dissolution of the Federation, and in 1838, El Salvador became an independent republic. The stability was short-lived. The country returned to international prominence during the Civil War, which began in 1979 when a coup overthrew the president and installed a civil-military junta. This junta harshly repressed the opposition, and the situation worsened with the assassination of an archbishop. followed by the deaths of 42 people in protests against the government. The conflict intensified, with the government, far-right paramilitary groups, and left-wing guerrillas clashing until '92. In this scenario, the United States and the Soviet Union supported both sides within the context of the Cold War. From this conflict emerged the ARENA and FMLN parties, which dominated Salvadoran politics in the following decades. With the end of the war, the country began its reconstruction process, but difficulties continued, especially with gang violence. And it was against this chaotic backdrop that Nayib Bukele emerged, a figure who would not go unnoticed. With his backwards cap and leather jacket, he looked more like an ordinary young man than a president. But the impact of his actions was far from ordinary. In a short time, the country saw a drastic change in security. Number 7. Buell Lism. When Bukele won the elections in 2019, he quickly earned the nickname of Millennial President. And it was no wonder. Young, always wearing a leather jacket and a cap, he used the old Twitter as his main means of communication. But what really caught the eye was his ability to transform El Salvador, known for its high homicide rates, into a very different place. For those who follow the situation closely, you already know what Bukele did. An emergency regime to combat violent gangs, which brought 2 years of harsh measures. He arrested thousands of members of these organizations, built a mega prison, and sent the number of incarcerations skyrocketing. This brought peace to the country, but also heavy criticism for possible human rights violations. Despite this, many politicians in Latin America see him as an example to be followed. So much so that they have even given his style a name, Buellism. And even those who don't know him in depth can see that he has become one of the most talked about figures in politics today. But what few people know is that even with all this popularity, Bukele ran for president again in 2024 in a move that defied the Constitution, which forbids re-election. That's right. Theoretically, re-election can't happen in El Salvador. And once again, he shot up in the polls, with his second term starting in June. And so the story of El Salvador continues, always full of challenges and changes. Number 8. War over soccer. Another curious fact about the country's history, which is also related to war conflicts, is the so-called football war. And however folkloric it may seem, the truth is that sport was just a pretext for a struggle that had been going on for a long time. That's because El Salvador was a small country, but more populous than Honduras. Many people migrated from one country to the other during the 20th century, causing land disputes. Until in the 1960s, the Honduran government took away many rights from Salvadoran peasants and confiscated land in order to defend U.S. landowners and companies. The fuse came when the two countries faced each other in the qualifiers for the World Cup in 1970. The matches between El Salvador and Honduras had already led to violent fights, both in Tegucigalpa and San Salvador. The playoff, held in Mexico City, was also marred by violence, and the climate of tension only increased. It was the excuse El Salvador needed. Shortly afterwards, the Salvadoran army invaded Honduras, starting what became known as the 100 Hours War. In less than 4 days, the conflict was over, but the damage had been done. Thousands of Salvadorans were forced to return to their country in even worse living conditions, a factor that would later fuel the civil war. Number 9. Joya de Serene. And still on the subject of exciting stories, did you know that in El Salvador there is a small archaeological site called Joya de Serene, which is considered the Pompeii of the Americas? You may have heard of Pompeii, the Roman city that was tragically buried by the ashes of Mount Vesuvius. The excavations revealed everything: preserved bodies, cooking utensils, even bread that was still in the oven. Now imagine something similar, but in the heart of Central America. Hoya de Quirén was a small Mayan village inhabited by farmers between the 400 and 600 years. And just like Pompeii, it was covered by a volcanic eruption. But unlike the Italian city, no bodies were found here. It seems that the inhabitants of Seren managed to flee in time, leaving behind their homes and everything they had. The most incredible thing is that this place offers us a rare window into the lives of ordinary people at the time. Instead of Mayan palaces and temples, what you see are simple houses, work tools, and a glimpse of what daily life was like for those who lived in the countryside, far from the spotlight of the nobility. What's more, this hidden treasure was declared a World Heritage Site by UNESCO in 1993, which only reinforces the importance of this place for understanding more about Mayan civilization and how ordinary people lived, not just the elites. Number 10. Tazumal Pyramid. And to complete this dossier on El Salvador, we couldn't miss a fascinating place that deserves all our attention: the Pyramid of Tazumal. Located in Chalchuapa, this archaeological relic is over 1,500 years old and is one of the most impressive vestiges of the ancient Mayan civilization that inhabited the region. What makes it even more special is the fact that it was built with volcanic rock, directly linking the history of the Maya to the unique geography of the country. It's as if the land of El Salvador itself held ancient secrets in its formations. In addition to the pyramid, the archaeological complex also has tombs, drainage systems, and ritual artifacts, showing that this site was a vital center of ceremonial and commercial activities in ancient times. It may not have the size of Mexico's Great Pyramids, but its historical value cannot be ignored. And so we conclude our journey through these fascinating chapters of El Salvador's history, full of mysteries and incredible discoveries. If you enjoyed this trip and want to continue exploring topics like this, don't forget to follow the next videos and turn on your notifications to stay up to date. Thank you for being with us so far. See you in the next episode of our Bello Mundo adventure.